Welcome to the second session on applied demography and the noisy measurements. This session was organized at the behest of the organizers, who asked a group of us to kind of get together and try to actively start a conversation between people who think on one end on the technical side about differential privacy and algorithms and statistical guarantees and whatnot, and on the other hand, the consumers of the data who are really working in the realm of applied demography. And so Amy O'Hara here and I started these conversations, and together with the organizers, we invited a number of other people to join. So we have Amy here from Georgetown, Eric Guthrie from the state of Minnesota, Jan Vink, who works with New York State. I guess your affiliation is Cornell, right? And then I'm Adam Smith from Boston University, and my colleague Mark Bunn is also here. And the goals were to encourage discussion among this group, but really not just to seed a discussion among these sort of communities more than just among the specific people here. And one of the concrete things we're hoping to do are to try and articulate some well-defined and specific problems, perhaps easy, perhaps challenging, that technical researchers could work on, whose solutions would actually be useful to the people who are consuming the data in terms of making good use of the kinds of things that the census is actually putting out. We're focusing on, most of the conversation will focus on the noisy measurements, the technical level focus on the noisy measurements file, although the things that are, in many cases, what's being produced are these post-processed versions, which are slightly different, and that distinction will come up in a few places. But really, we're hoping that like everybody here, either on Zoom or live, will also be participating. So feel free to jump in with questions, feel free to add to the discussion. We'll be talking for a little bit, and then we've got time for open discussion at the end of the session. So Amy will start with just some background on a kind of applied demography and what that actually means, and so to put everybody on the same page. Then Eric, Jan, and Amy will present some of the specific issues they've faced as they've tried to work with census data, and just kind of give a flavor of the specific problems that they need to solve and how these things come up. Mark and I will speak a little bit about some of the sort of more abstract questions we can tease out of these discussions and that we think might be interesting starting points for conversation. And then there's a general discussion, and ideally that involves everybody here. Okay, so for now we'll start with Amy, who will be telling us what demographers do all day.
Hi, thank you. Was I not supposed to click enter?
I think you need to switch to the other slide deck.
Oh, okay.
So whichever yours is.
All right, so I'm going to be explaining a bit about the data that are out there, how the data are used, and showing some examples that hopefully illustrate why this is an issue. When people say the blocks are really challenging, the blocks are really noisy, maybe you shouldn't use them, but then trying to explain why the blocks might need to be used. So we're focusing here on decennial program data. The Census Bureau produces a lot of information, and we're here focusing on the decennial census data, which is the census of population and housing. And in that same program, there's also the population estimates and the American Community Survey. But the decennial data, there are three major files that are released: the apportionment data, the redistricting data file, and, as you've heard a lot about already, the DHC that has a lot of the detailed characteristics. So for census, things to remember: the apportionment data are already out there. No noise were added. It's the actual head count in every single state. The redistricting data are also out there, and we've heard a bit about that as well. Michael explained that it used the top-down algorithm. And now we're waiting to see what comes out in the DHC and the detailed DHC, which is what Ashwin was just covering earlier. And again, that disclosure avoidance strategy is not yet known. So when you're thinking about the 2020 data products, there's a different amount of information that's coming out in each of these products. And we've also heard a bit about this already, so I'm not going to, I'll tread pretty lightly here. But just showing that the demographers aren't really satisfied with what's already come out in the redistricting data, and they are very interested in what's going to be coming out in the DHC and for the detailed DHC as well. But the real focus here is on that demographic and household characteristics file. So consider a household. Here we have, and this is similar to what Ashwin's already shown you, but my example is trying to tease out what is published in these different data sets. So it's a household that has a woman who is the head of household, her spouse, their child who's 14 years old, and then a grandmother, say the head of household's mother. And for apportionment, count of 4, easy. When you get to the redistricting data file, there were 3 adults and 1 child by their race and Hispanic origin. But when you get to the DHC, you're going to be releasing a lot more information. And within the different geographies that data are produced at, it's going to have information on their household size, the type of household, whether the housing unit was owned or rented, whether they have a mortgage. And then the detailed DHC, that's where even more rich information comes, and Ashwin already showed us this a bit, but here, although the box that I have at the top says that they were Asian and Pacific Islander, when you get to the detailed DHC, you see a further breakdown, that it's not just Asian, that this is that 3 of the household members identified as Filipino as well. So this is the sort of rich information. In 2010, there were up to 331 detailed race and Hispanic origin categories released. So those can be released at higher levels of geography with that really rich detail. And whenever you think of the decennial census program, the tagline is everybody counts. It's your turn to be counted. Tell us about you. Show us the rich fabric of America. And in some of these other data products, that detail doesn't come out, but in the detailed DHC, that's where some of that information can be disseminated. So you've heard a bit about geographies and how many there are. And here I just want to pull that apart a little bit. You know that there are over 3,000 counties. You've heard there are over 80,000 tracts. There are over 8 million blocks. But when we talk about getting the data out for these, a lot of the tracts and a lot of the blocks have 0 population. And we've heard some of the presentations today talking about how you're dealing with those zeros. But over on the right-hand side of this slide, I want to point out the complexity of what we're dealing with in the country. So there are 142 blocks, those little tiny units that have very large populations. The block itself has 3,000 people. But then there are 185 counties that have populations under 3,000. And when you take that county, it is composed of tracts. The tracts are composed of block groups. The block groups are composed of blocks. And if the population is that small, you can see how for looking at the US as a whole, for some of our geographies, you don't have a problem when you're protecting privacy. But in many, many, many of these counties and tracts and block groups and blocks, you're dealing with this incredible low population density, which makes it very difficult to privacy protect the data. But the data are absolutely essential for demographers because these are the building blocks that they are using. We've heard also today about the spine, so I'm really not going to touch upon this other than to say that there was the standard hierarchy and then the hierarchy that was used with the DAS for the 2020. And we saw it described this morning as this is what was used for redistricting, which to me begs the question, is there yet a different spine that is needed for these other products whenever you need to try to figure out how to have the most accurate information produced for the data users? So why should you be using blocks at all? Census has already told everybody the blocks are noisy. Beware of the blocks. Well, in many places, there is a legal necessity to use them. There is law that says you will use the census data. And so if the census data need to be used at a geography that is much more granular than just county, then you might have to use this. There are also lots of places that have off-spine geographies. And for applied demographers, they often need to create these custom geographies. Someone comes in and says, I need this polygon, I need to know the population here, and that could be useful whenever they need to think about where they're going to be siting a sewage treatment plant, for instance. There's also legacy issues. And so we know that a lot of the discussion about changing the disclosure avoidance system for the 2020 census happened pretty late in the cycle. So you have demographers that already have systems and models and codes that are expecting these geographies. And they had made it all the way through the decade without any indication that that wasn't going to happen this time. So now they're trying to figure out how they can get the granular information that they need for their estimates, for their projections, if there is going to be a change in the accuracy of the information that they are given to work with. So I want to focus, give you some examples here, and I'm going to be focusing on Detroit and Michigan. So when you think about Michigan, looks like a mitten, 83 counties, and the overall population of Michigan is the line graph on the right. And I have my little warning thing there because the population estimates would have implied a certain trend line, and then we had the 2020 census, and it went up. And so that could be good news for Michigan, right? So did the population really increase? Were the population estimates somehow flawed? Was this some sort of a data collection issue? Like what's going on with Michigan? And then we're going to drill into Detroit. Well, the population of Detroit really tailed off. So looking at my line graph there, you can see the little warning sign over at 2020, where you would have seen that Detroit's population had been in decline, but was actually plateauing toward the end of the decade. And then you got to the 2020 census, which admittedly, when you look at the Census Bureau's self-response map, there were parts of Detroit that had really low self-response for the census, and then they had to send people out and try to collect data during the pandemic. So maybe there's an undercount. Maybe there are sketchy counts within the city, and on top of that, the users are saying, but what did the privacy protection do to our numbers? So this is part of the uncertainty right now, is not being able to decompose the nature of the error in the data. So you're looking at Detroit, and we've already heard that the housing counts, the number of housing units was invariant. We knew how many residential structures there were. However, there was noise added to the number of occupied housing counts. So here in this neighborhood, there might have been 250 housing units, and that was the real number, but the number of occupied housing units had some noise. The number of people within each of the occupied housing units also had some noise, and the characteristics of the individuals in those housing units has some noise. So when you're looking at the line graph and you say what happened, you really can't tell right now. But the thing I want you to take away from this is that that line graph isn't going to stop in 2020. There's going to be a whole bunch more data points that move forward, and the 2020 census is the base upon which these communities had built as they're making their population estimates into the next decade. So advance this line graph out to the right, and you're adding more data points. If that 2020 number was suspect, how is Detroit going to adjust their population estimates, or are they going to have to live with that new, much lower number that is lower than trend? And I have in the corner there the Michigan overall. This is something else that we're curious about, because Michigan overall, the population went up, Detroit, the population went down. We know that whenever the application of noise happened, that it likely moved some population from place to place. The whole overall picture leaves us with more questions than we have answers to, and hopefully more data will be forthcoming that can help us unpack this. So something about Detroit. Now you know that you have this population for Detroit, you have all these census geographies. Is that enough? Well, within Detroit, there are policing precincts that are there on the left, and there are water districts that are there on the right. And ideally, these would all tally up with the different census building blocks that have been released. That would be the ideal, but they don't always line up that way. Sometimes you have a guy with a Sharpie that drew a boundary, and it doesn't cut cleanly around these census geographies. So that is a problem. That is why you need to have accurate data at that lower level of geography so that you can combine them for tabulating what you need. I thought a really good example here was this graphic on the left, which was asthma by zip code. And Eric pointed out that this is something that is very neighborhood specific. So even within these zip codes, the folks in Detroit are like, we have to try to address this neighborhood by neighborhood. And zip codes notoriously do not align with census geographies. And I've illustrated that over on the right, that the two highest asthma counties on the left, I've zoomed in on the right, and you can see that some of them are spanning zip codes. The boundaries need to be divided, so you want to be able to parse out the population between your zip codes if you're going to be acting with that geography. So that's one example of the complexity of the census data. And another, as I said a minute ago, the neighborhoods matter. So this is another image of Detroit, and the red lines that you can see are tracts, but black lines are neighborhoods. And a lot of initiatives are applied at the neighborhood level, and anytime that you can see a gray line on this map, that means that the tract was bisected, that in order to define the neighborhood, you had to split a tract. And if you're splitting a tract, you're probably going to have to be looking at the blocks in order to figure out how you're parsing your population. So this is an example of why wouldn't you just get away from using blocks? Well, sometimes you have to, and it depends on the place in the country that you're looking at. The other thing I want to point out quickly is that the census data are great in the years ending with 0, but these demographers need data the other 9 years as well. And they make population estimates. And as I showed you with those line graphs, the census data form the population base that are then used for the population estimates in the other 9 years. And so some of the types of estimates I've put over in the graphic on the right. This isn't just how many people are there. It could be small area estimates, it could be county age by sex, it could be special race and ethnicity cuts. But you have these requests that you produce on an annual basis, but then you also get the occasional request from the governor. And you have to address that. You've got to use the building blocks that you have from the census data. So what do they use whenever they're doing these estimates? There are two main methods, and one is the housing unit method, where you start with that population base, census, and then you're keeping track of what's happening with your housing stock through the decade. So you're looking at building permits and demolitions and whether you had any natural disasters. You're looking at conversions that went from commercial to residential, and then you're putting people in them. So you need a good census housing unit occupied number in order to pull this forward through the decade. Oh, keep moving. And then there's also the cohort component method, and for that you're looking at the people. So you're taking the census data and you're incrementing that every year, looking at the vital records. Who are the entries and who are the exits? Entries could be in-migration or births. Exits could be deaths or out-migration. But to do that properly, you've got to have good census population counts, and we know that those were noisy. So the two main things that applied demographers do rely on accurate census data as inputs. And that's really challenging. That's what we're here to talk about. How can they get more information so that they can calibrate their methods or potentially adjust their methods to absorb that extra noisiness and be able to produce the numbers that they need with validity? So just to recap, these applied demographers, they are a critical set of users. They are in every single state. They produce these estimates and projections every single year, okay? This is their job. They need these inputs to do their job. But they're also providing technical assistance to the jurisdictions all through their state. Whether that is a town, whether that is a site, that's their job. They also respond to special data requests. Like I said, the governor needs a number, the legislature needs this information. And importantly, they are providing technical assistance back to Census as Census is trying to figure out how they are going to be adjusting these methods, which is why this session is so important to try to get all of us self-proclaimed nerds talking to each other in a more productive fashion. And I included at the bottom there, this isn't just like, this is the demographer widget. They are doing this work in the states under a variety of titles, under a variety of different departments. And so the essential thing to understand is that they need accurate data to do their jobs. And the data need to be accurate for the population, showing the rich characteristics of the population, and at geographies. So thank you. Who's next?
Yeah, that's right. Eric's up. Robin, is anybody monitoring the chat or engaging with that? Because we don't have. I mean, I can bring a laptop up here and try to do that live. All right, great.
Perfect.
We do. Yeah, we do.
There you go.
Go for it.
Great. Well, excuse me. It is wonderful to be here in a group full of folks again after being behind a Zoom screen for so long. And I think that this overlapping group of nerds is wonderful, and it's really going to help to push the conversation forward, because I think that what we all want is something similar. What we all want is a system that works, and is a system that works in terms of both providing data that is necessary and protecting respondents. One thing that I heard in particular today that kind of struck me a little bit, and I just wanted to mention because I've heard it for several years, is that there's a kind of a dichotomous way of thinking about this process, where technical folks are trying to protect people and data analysts only want more accurate data and are against privacy. And that's not the case, and it never has been the case. We understand that privacy is important. We understand that privacy is necessary, and we want to do the best we can to make sure that respondents are protected. But it is not a dichotomous relationship where one side wants to protect people and the other side has no concern for the protection of people. That is not and has never been the case. I am, by training, a rural sociologist and a rural demographer, so small places matter to me. They matter quite a bit. And one thing that is particularly important are functioning units of government. Units of government that have people in them and that are necessary because they have legal requirements on them. They have to manage funds. They have to produce reports. They have to be responsive to the people that live within their jurisdictions. The map that I produced here are the functioning governmental units within the state of Minnesota, and there are only two types of functioning governmental units that I'm displaying here. These are just cities and townships, and so it's really a combination of a portion of the Census Bureau's place concept and a portion of the Census Bureau's county subdivision county subdivision concept, and it gets kind of close to that MCD concept as well. And the way that I produce this type of illustration is I take all the whole cities from the place file and I exclude the CDPs, and then I take all of the townships from our county subdivision file, and when you merge those together, you get a mutually exclusive and exhaustive mapping of the state. So that's the way that I produce the data set. There are some gray areas at the top of Minnesota that are not functioning units of government, that either have no population in them or they have no governmental structure. And I had to put zero population or no government because there are people that live in some of these gray spaces. They just live in what are called unorganized territories. They don't have governments. They're not living. They're not living in the wilderness, or well, they are living in the wilderness. They're not living. Sort of the call the wild Alaska sort of experience, but they are living in a very rural, sparsely populated section. But those are not the folks that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here are the functioning units of government, the townships and the cities that have responsibilities to people. Now, some of those responsibilities may be a little light. You'll notice that the lowest category, the lowest number in my smallest band is 1. So there are areas, some of these functioning units of government, quote unquote, that have 1 person in them. That person's responsibilities are both heavy and light at the same time, right? They don't have a lot of constituents to listen to, hopefully, but they do still have responsibilities. You know, they have to produce, they have to take in things from the state, and they have to provide input to the state. And something that I think is particularly important is the number and proportionality of the sizes of these functioning units of government. When we talk about functioning units of government that are less than 250 people, which is a threshold for accuracy when we're aggregating up small units, we're talking about 40% of the functioning units of government in my state. Right? Think about that for a second. 40% of the functioning units of government in my state may or may not be able to get quality data by aggregating their blocks. It's problematic and it's concerning. And we can see that for those of you that are unlucky enough not to know the great state of Minnesota as well as I do, the blue and the green area in the eastern central part of the state is the Twin Cities metropolitan area. It's the Twin Cities metro area. It's the 7-county area that kind of is the most urbanized core of the state. There are other metropolitan areas in the state, but it's what we think of as the Met area, the Met Council area, and it's the most populated area. And we can see that that's blue and green, and the statistics in that area are, by and large, for the most part, pretty good. Now let's compare that to the geographic size of the state that is red and yellow and orange. You can see that there's quite a bit of the state that has or is going to be able to, or is not going to necessarily be able to aggregate data from the block level and get data that we can always confidently say is going to be accurate. And that's problematic, and that's concerning. Now, when I present this, I want to make sure that I'm not overstating something and being trying to say that there's a catastrophe. When we look at these places, we have to recognize also that 70 or 65% of the people live in places that are in excess of 10,000 people, right? So I do understand that whereas most people live in aggregated in larger places, these small places still have people as well, and they still have responsibilities to those people and to the state as well. Okay, so one way that these data are used is that we use them to produce annual small area estimates. So every area that was colored on that map, I produce an estimate for annually. Actually, even the gray places, I produce an estimate for. We just aggregate them together because there's no functioning unit of government in there, and so it's kind of a balance of state, balance of county area that gets created for the gray areas. But we make an estimate for every place, every year. We would, a lot of people would like to do certain types of estimates. Cohort component method would be great, but cohort component methods are very data intensive. We need a lot of data in order to be able to do those types of estimates, so they're not always possible. And so instead we use the housing unit estimate. I probably need to stay closer to the mic. I'm sorry. I present like a preacher. I walk around and I get into it. So I got to remind myself to stay tied to this podium. We use a housing unit method, and what we need in order to do that is our good housing unit totals, and we should have that with the invariance from the Census Bureau. We also need good occupancy data, which is a little bit more questionable in terms of the data and based on what we know about the size of places from the last map. And we need persons per household in order to do this as well. And that's problematic because, from the data that's been released so far, even though we have persons and we have households, we've been told not to combine those to produce a persons per household because there are accuracy issues with those because they're produced separately. So that this is becoming problematic and concerning, especially as we've learned recently that the next data products have been pushed out further than for publication than we had previously thought they might be. So we need housing unit totals, good occupancy data, and persons per household. We multiply the occupied housing units by the persons per household to get an estimate. There are some other things that we do as well. I'm kind of simplifying. We add group quarters to it. We control to other totals. But basically, we do an estimate of by multiplying our persons per household times our occupied housing units. And it's not a simple thing were we to need to move to a persons per housing unit, which is would be a different statistic, and it would require the really recreation, rethinking of the way that we do this work, which we weren't really ready, which we were not ready to do because we weren't really told that we were going to need to do it. But that would be a different statistic and a different way of producing estimates. So that's kind of the way that we do our annual estimates. And these are vital estimates because they're used for resource allocation, things like dispersing local government aid from the state down to the local agencies, dispersing other types of funds as well, and also for these local areas to maintain this sense of self, right? This sense of place. It's important for them to understand both the size and composition of their population. I know it's when we were promoting the census, because we worked very close with the Census Bureau and we were promoting Census 2020. One of the things that we were telling folks is that the census is about voice, and the census is about funding, and in order to be counted means that your voice is being counted, and a lot of local folks in these small areas are very concerned about their voice and whether it's going to be counted or not. I see my time. I need to make sure that I'm moving a little bit more quickly here. The statistical reality is controlled to the census in a lot of ways. Small population areas and units of government benefit less from the ACS than larger areas. It's not difficult to find in our rural areas places and data where a statistic from the American Community Survey, where the margin of error exceeds the statistic for a particular area. So those data are not necessarily useful. So the decennial census becomes the point from which the small areas really understand themselves and understand their relation to the larger world. Geographic granularity is very important. And when we cross these geographic levels, that creates conflicting accuracy needs. And what I'm thinking about here are census tracts, right? Because that has been a level of geography where data is talking about being published in the DHC, and we know that we've been told by the Census Bureau, and it makes a logical sense to us as well, that age is one of the most disclosive. Age in combination with location is one of the most disclosive variables, but it is also one of the most important variables for us and the way that we do our work. So we need to come to mutual understanding about what is required and what is necessary for those. And like I said, when data is only going to be released at the tract level, what does that mean? Higher population cities often contain many census tracts, and Amy showed you that with the city of Detroit. However, when we talk about lower population cities and towns, we're often talking about them being contained by census tracts, and often with many of their neighbors as well. Just quickly, when I was looking at the state of Minnesota, and I was looking on average, there is 1.8 units of government per census tract. If I remove the metropolitan area, that almost doubles to 3.5 units of government per census tract. So that's concerning and problematic when we think about there could be potentially 3 different townships or cities within a single census tract, and they individually need to understand their space within that census tract. I preceded my last bullet, excuse me. I want to talk about quickly in the last 45 seconds I have, a county in Minnesota. Wilkin County is one of our smallest counties, and it has 2 census tracts. This census tract is Breckenridge, Minnesota. Wonderful place. That tract only has 1 unit of government in it. When we think about the rest of the county, which is the other census tract, there are 29 units of government in that. What did I say? 29 units of government in that 1 census tract, where we may not have, where we don't necessarily understand how that data are going to be split up and what the accuracy is going to be for those component parts. I'm over my time, but quickly, I was taking a look at noisy median ages out of the demonstration data, and I did not put the, I'm neglected to put the source for these data. The IPUMs out of the University of Minnesota ingest the Census Bureau's DHC file and makes them a little bit easier to use for folks, so that is extremely helpful. So I wanted to make sure that I gave them credit for doing that. But when we look at these data, we can see that these small areas do have significant variances in their median ages between the summary file 1 and the data that was released for the demonstration product. Is a very difficult map to read because it's a very difficult subject to talk about. But what I'm primarily getting at is if you're making age-based decisions based on these data, and there are significant variations, I'm using median age as a summary statistic for the age distribution in a particular area, and if we're seeing significant changes in the median age, I worry about what the underlying age distribution is experiencing, and that's something that I'm working on internally to help provide feedback to the Bureau on, and I'm a little bit over time, but sorry.
Great. All right, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Question from online. Okay, I guess this is a question for Amy, and I think Eric too. Salil Vadan asks, do demographers have standard ways of measuring the uncertainty in the 2 methods of population estimates that Amy described? And Salil says that if so, it seems possible in principle to do a comparison of how the noise introduced for privacy compares to the existing uncertainty, say at the 5-year midway point.
Can you just repeat the question also while we're getting microphone?
So this is a question from Salil. Do demographers have standard ways of measuring the uncertainty in the 2 methods of population estimates that Amy described? And if so, it seems possible in principle to do a comparison of how the noise introduced for privacy compares to the existing uncertainty, say at the 5-year midway point.
You know, oftentimes when we're looking at the cohort component method in particular, we don't have necessarily a margin of error or something akin to that for those data, because it's not really that type of statistical processing. It's really based on an accounting method where we're taking a base, we're adding to it over a period, and we're coming up with a new total. We're not really making the type of inferences where we would have a standard like margin of error type of thing. So, for example, when we're doing population projections with a cohort component method, oftentimes what we will do is we will wait a number of years and then compare it to what has to other sources that have been published. So, for example, the decennial census or the population estimates or something like that, and see how close they are to those other sets. So that's one way that we look at measuring error in cohort component method models, and it's similar for our other models as well. We use them, we compare them to other methods for producing data, and it's similar to, I think, what the Bureau does for determining accuracy for the decennial census, right? They produce numbers from different methods, and they compare how close they were Right, DA or the P, thank you. Yeah, or PES, excuse me. I'm the one on the mic, so.
Thank you. Let's move on to Jan, and we'll come back to questions also.
I wanted to thank everybody, and especially the organizers, for inviting us and to open up this discussion and learn from each other. I think it's very important to have us together in one room and talk about our daily work. Over the last few years, I've been very active in providing feedback to the Census Bureau on the demonstration data. Yeah, kind of. I care about census data. I care about accuracy. I also care about privacy, as Eric said, and I want to contribute in finding the balance as good as possible. My feedback sometimes was pointing out things that just didn't make sense. I would call them errors, or others might call them different, but I think my main contribution to the whole discussion has been pointing out systematic errors that were added because of the post-processing, pointing out where those systematic errors occurred. I also wanted to mention a pet peeve that kind of has developed over the years in those many discussions, and that's accuracy and utility. A lot of people, I noticed, see them as synonymous, and they are not synonymous. It's important to make the distinction between accuracy and utility. And if you present that curve, privacy on one axis, I think it should be accuracy on the vertical axis, and utility is something else. Somebody else in the discussion mentioned, and I like that description that came kind of to the core of my pet peeve, is there's a lot of talk about future behavior by bad guys, and we have to protect them against. There is very little discussion about unexpected or unforeseen use of the census data. And if you only concentrate on existing use cases, you might miss the future use cases. I think that was important to point out. Talking about my daily life as a demographer, I start with the about page of the program I work at, Program of Applied Demographics. I see my role as providing data to all kinds of organizations within the state of New York, and also promote responsible use of that data, and including the census data, including the privacy or disclosure avoidance system data. And we talk with a lot of people throughout the state, from state agencies to people in a neighborhood. And we also serve as state representative in the federal state cooperative on population estimates. And I put those objectives here on my slide. Eric and I are both members of the steering committee of this cooperative. I'm the chair currently, and we talk a lot with the Census Bureau about population estimates and how to make them as good as possible. We also learn from each other our state estimates, and yeah, we want consistent population estimates, and having a good census is very important for that work. Eric and Amy both kind of talked about this. I tried to display it in a chart from how do we use the census data. We use the census data a lot to calculate those indicators Eric also mentioned, things like the PPA, the population per household, things like the median age. Those are very important indicators for us. We also combine the census data with external data to get all kinds of rates and ratios. Those indicators and rates and ratios then, together with the census data, feed into all kinds of estimates and projection models. They start with the census data, at least in the past they always started with the census data, and those indicators and rates and ratios are used in the modeling to project the population in the future, or project or estimate current population. Also, there is updated external data that also can feed in those estimates and projections. So what comes out of those estimates and projections are updated populations. We use those indicators and rates and ratios kind of to build a picture, a demographic picture of a neighborhood, of a town, and those estimates and projections allow us to update those pictures, those demographic pictures. And especially in using those indicators, it's important to find those relations between indicators, use part of the model, but also kind of explaining that changing demographic picture, what does that mean for your community, for your neighborhood? As an example, I made a picture of the median age throughout New York. You can clearly see that there are parts of New York that have a higher median age, and other parts of New York that have a more younger population. This is not a coincidence. There is something in those towns and townships that might have caused the younger people to move out or attract older people. Look closer, some of the student towns jump out because they have the younger populations. You can do the same for persons per household. It's not uniform, it's not random. It contributes to a profile of the towns. Talking about the relations between those indicators, there is a clear, not very clear, but there is a relationship between the median age and the population per household. So our estimation and projection models produce an updated median age, so we can kind of translate that to an updated persons per household, but it's not necessarily part of our projection model. It's also kind of clear, this is at the block group level, that there is certainly something else explaining this relationship. And it goes off in two separate paths. Other example, home ownership and median age. If you project a median age or estimate an updated median age, it kind of says something about your demand of homes built to own. The relationship is we use the census data a lot and census data is kind of the only source we can use to create those kinds of relationships. ACS, with all its uncertainty, those relationships just become not as clear, and especially if you want to go to lower levels of geography like a block group. So, some other examples of indicators, some are age-based, some are race-based, they play a role either in policy but also in research. If you want to research local communities, then all those indicators become very important. And there are a couple of indicators that are combining data from the person in the unit file that we see as very important, and that's pretty hard to estimate with the current DHC. Another thing I wanted to mention, and I didn't put on a slide, is that applied demographers are very proficient in working with incomplete data or uncertain data with errors. and things we do a lot is smoothing age profiles. And I think that having the random or the data before the post-processing, have that available, might help us in better smoothing of the age data, and that's an application I actually wanted to mention. My contact information. Thank you.
Oh, do we have a? Yeah, I mean, why don't you set up and then if there are questions. Oh, Sesha?
If you want to read, or do you have a good question?
Sasha.
You should go ahead. Okay. Thank you so much. I think I want to follow up on Salil's, on Salil's question, just so that I myself understand better what's going on. So when you compute median age, you said something, we're basically doing some type of accounting rather than, I guess, modeling or statistical modeling. Am I misunderstanding that? And I think my question is, you're plotting median age. You can have a distribution of median age. I mean, you must be, is there any computation of any error? I mean, let's say empirical variance capturing here, or no? I think in part, you know, Salil was really asking, I think, is there some kind of variance that you're computing, or you're just computing median age as is from the observed data, and you're not concerned with any underlying distribution? Is that?
Yes, we are just using the data as reported and as generated by our models. At the moment, we are not using an interval around that.
Okay.
It's one number for each geographic area.
But when you have incomplete data and you go into smoothing, again, what does that mean? Are you doing completion by using some kind of missing data modeling, or I think we're trying to understand here, right, from the inference perspective. One is to report the number as is, and we you know, there has to be some underlying variability there, uncertainty.
Can I pull apart two concepts
Please.
that I'm hearing?
Yeah.
One is for the cohort component model, traditionally you would start with a decennial census.
Yep.
And the reason they aren't putting error intervals around the cohort, the way you're adjusting the cohort, there are counts of births and there are counts of deaths.
I
So
see.
you're using those administrative counts, and that's why Eric said it was an accounting method. And then the other issue that I wanted to pull apart, when they're talking about smoothing, if the Bureau put out statistics for a 5-year age interval, but to understand your anticipated needs for the WIC program, you needed to know which kids are going to be between 0 and 2, you had to rake down from the 0 to 5 bucket into that smaller, I'm an economist. I'm looking at these guys to make sure that this is going okay. The smoothing is when you need to have a different age category than was published, and that could involve aggregating up and smoothing, or it could involve raking down whenever a bucket was released that was not refined enough for your needs.
I see.
And I would like to add to that, there is a very strong correlation between cohorts. Very strong.
Sure.
Number of 6 years old and number of 7 years old is in a very small area. There might be more volatility between those 6 and the 7 years old. So with smoothing,
Yep.
you can kind of take care of that and get especially if you move forward. Then, yeah, if you do it by single years of age, that peak would move forward as well, and you kind of prefer a more smoothed line that just works better.
Michael, yeah.
Do you adjust for the cohort model? Do you adjust the census counts for known undercounts and overcounts from PBS? Or no?
Sometimes.
I think the
I think, if I understood, Michael, he was asking, do you account for either undercounting or overcounting in your, when you do smoothing from the data that's provided?
It depends. The Census Bureau so far, up to 2010, used the census. Now, at one point, they also had an adjusted age where they took care of the heaping a little bit, which is another problem coming out of the census, that there are much more 60 years old than 61 years old. Because if you ask the neighbor from how old is your neighbor, it's more likely that you answer 60 or 65 than that you answer 63. That you exactly know. There is an age heaping if you look at the census results. In the past, the Census Bureau smoothed that out. Not recently. For the 2020, the discussion is still ongoing, what the Census Bureau is doing with under and over count. A lot of states produce their own estimates, and some states will adjust the census count for their purposes.
Okay, can I ask one more question? Hopefully this is part of the discussion. I can also wait if you want Amy to comment. I'm asking the. So I also had a question. I think what's important when I think about inference, one is on undercounting. Amy mentioned this. There are two sources of error. It's hard to perhaps to differentiate. One could be undercounting, another one is coming from noise. So I wanted to ask, undercounting has happened before, right? What are the methods and tools that you use, again, to adjust for undercounting? And I think the second question that I had was, you were looking at the differences in median, I'll call them estimates, median age estimates, between the summary file 1, if I understood, and it was in the current, or the 2010 DHA, the new release. I'm not sure which one, but.
Out of the most recent,
right.
Out of the most recent DP
right.
release and
yeah.
the summary file one. Yeah.
So we all know there is a noise added. I think what I'm curious as to how, why is it that you accepted the previous released data, which is, as Amy pointed out, a base for computing many subsequent statistics, as the data with no error, when it's been shown that there are errors in previous releases as well. And so is it that you felt that the error was minimal, or what was the reasoning? I'm trying to understand. The errors were there before, and also when you were computing the differences with summary file 1, is it with the public version of summary file 1, or did you have a chance, and not just for this calculation, for any calculation, do you actually go into the RDC when you're doing population estimates, or are you really just using the publicly available census data? So there's a couple of questions there, so I can break them down if needed again. But
the RDC would be difficult in order to get this work done in a timely manner, just because of how the process by which you need to go through in order to get an RDC project worked on and improved. I actually tried to do one for my dissertation, and the RDC manager said, "No, it's going to take you a very long time to get that particular project pushed through, and your advisor will be retired by the time you get it done." So no, we don't often do them in the RDC because of the process that we need to go through. And remember, we have to produce these estimates annually, every
yes.
year, and this just would not allow for that. And when I had a comment on the first part of your question. Could
on the error accounting or comparison of the.
So when I was looking at the median age, I was trying to my point, what I was going to make was I was trying to get a summary statistic about the distribution, because it's the distribution that I'm really concerned about, because that is what's important when we're doing a lot of work for projecting and understanding, because we need to use that distribution to produce the next set of births that happen, because we need to know how many women fall into each particular age group so that we can multiply that by specific fertility rates to get the next step in our accounting method, right? And yes, there has been error in the census data in the past, and obviously there always is going to be the error in this large of a data collection, but the data traditionally have, for the most part, the data has not, the problem, the error in the data have not risen to the point where they have caused problems in the model, and at that point, if they do, that's when we look at making some adjustments. The way I talk about it is when I'm talking to local leaders in the past, they have said, there might be something here, I don't know exactly what it is, but now with the data that have been released, the local leaders are like, there's a problem right here, I can see where it's at, and what can we do to fix it, right? And so that is the difference in the type of error we're talking about. And I don't have a method necessarily yet to understand how to work with that error. That's what I'm thinking this group is going to be talking about, and understanding how to help everybody understand and work with this new system and this new way that these data are coming out and used.
So if I understood correctly, just to summarize, I think it's important for us as we're trying to think about how to help this process move forward. With previously available data, the users felt that the error observed was negligible, and there were no adjustments, or perhaps adjustments were rarely being made. Now, if adjustments are rarely being made, I think for me personally, I would love to see, and I apologize, I don't know enough about demography and the tools being used, examples of what kind of adjustments. Again, I understand you keep talking about accounting, but then in my mind, you're also talking about distributions. You're looking at distributions over age. There is some underlying statistical properties there that I'm hoping we should be able to utilize, right, in terms of accounting for some uncertainty. So again, it will be great to have some examples. If it doesn't have to have now, but I think to understand the current process.
Do you mean examples of how we use the distributions?
How you use the distributions, and if there were cases where adjustments were being made, what tools were used to make those adjustments?
I'd like to suggest this discussion of how to deal with the uncertainty that's there now and how it's currently dealt with, I think is an interesting one that maybe we can come back to. Let's move along, and then we come back to it during the discussion, which is getting shorter.
All right.
Go ahead.
I'll try to make this quick. This is a lot of maps and figures and tables, and I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I wanted to include them in a slide deck, knowing that the slides were going to be distributed so that you can come back and take a closer look. This is a particular example that Mike Mormon from the state of Washington pointed me to, and it has to do with this power station on that slide. Wouldn't you like to live near that? So you don't need to... Sure. Is that better? Okay. So you don't need to read all these words except for the ones that I highlighted, and my goal for having this slide up is for you to see that this affects money. Okay, this isn't just like, oh, I wonder how many women are going to have babies. This is money going from place to place to place. And it is encoded in law, and they have to make these population estimates that we've heard a lot about so far in the session. So that power plant, the acronym that they use is TEGFA. This is the affected area. So this is the guy with the Sharpie thing. They drew this big red circle around the power plant there in the middle, and the way that they are going to be distributing funds is based on portions of cities and counties, and on the right-hand side, portions of fire protection districts. So the cities and counties, you're okay because Census produces those geographies, but fire protection districts, this is another guy with a Sharpie that has said, we are going to cut this area up into fire protection districts, and within, those are the big black lines, and within each of them, there are lines in blue. So there are these other little subsets. These are custom geographies. Some of them align to census geography. Some of them do not align to census geography. But it doesn't change the fact that dollars are being distributed in Washington state based on these custom geographies that need to be produced, okay? So this is a breakout of the fire protection districts in just one of the counties. This is Benton County. And they need to create the population estimates for the parts that are serviced or unserviced that by certain fire protection organizations. And so that is this red hashed area. And I have this up here to show that these are very odd looking little sections that they need to create population estimates for. So this is hopefully showing to you, you need to have these subgeographies so that you can create the right amount of population in the red shaded area so you can figure out who is going to get money and who is not going to get money. So when the folks in Washington produce these population estimates, they do produce them with a disclaimer. You know, so this is an example. You can go back and you can read it. They encourage people to go review the maps that I had on the previous slide, and I do include those maps in this PowerPoint deck so that you can go back in there and pore over them if you choose to. But what do they actually produce? This is what pop estimates look like. These guys have just been saying there are a couple of methods that are used, but every single year of the decade, bounded by 2010 and 2020, you need to come up with these numbers because those numbers are going to dictate who is getting the money, the proceeds from this power plant operation, and who is not getting the money. Okay, so that latter part of the sentence, who is not getting the money, is the part that I want you to focus on because these numbers need to have a certain robustness so that that can be defensible. And so I'm going to flip through these quickly, but looking at the titles, they need to produce total pop, the total population for each of these fire protection districts. Again, across the top, what is the household population? Remember, total is the sum of household plus group quarters. What is the group quarter population? And you can see that I chose a county to look at here that does have a couple of subsets that have GQ. So this is a number that they actually do have to track over time. The nice thing is that with GQ, you can probably talk to the facility and get that number, but those other numbers, the total and the household pop, is something that they need to use either the cohort component or the housing unit method that you've now heard about. They also need to know the total housing units. This is great. We know that these were invariant. However, you need to know the occupied housing unit. So total number of little blocks that are little households, the structures themselves is invariant, but knowing which ones are occupied in 2020 is not invariant. And so that is why they use persons per household, just to kind of tie together the other presentations. So this is me zooming into one of these to show you that this is the fire protection district. These are the ones that you can go back in and look at as close-ups. But then I wanted to show you, if you've never looked at a map that had census geographies, this is what the tracts and block groups look like for part of Benton County. And so look at the numbers that are written in blue, and there are boundaries in blue. Those are your tracts, and then within them, there are little pink lines, and the little pink lines divide up the tracts into block groups. And so you can look at some of these. I want you to look particularly over here at Benton City. See that little area there? That is a city that is within a tract, and right under the words Benton City, there is the number 2. That's that block group, okay? Now, here, this is Benton City, and all of those lines and all of those little teeny tiny red numbers, those are the blocks. Okay, if you haven't actually dug in and you've been thinking about this as a statistical exercise, I encourage you to actually zoom in on some of these and look at it. This is the problem that the applied demographers have. There are people and there are businesses and there are funds being distributed, and it matters when you drill in, it matters how you're drilling in. And again, Benton City might be an adequate geography, but if you're talking about citing something back from my Detroit picture, if something went wildly wrong with a water treatment plant, you do need to understand what's going on here. You need to understand the types of households. Are they a lot of single mother households? Are they just older individuals living alone? So that's where the data in the past, though it was noisy, though it had swapping, it was relied upon because that's the job that these guys do, that we appreciate. That's all I have.
Okay, questions for So, Mark and I will, based on some of the, so in preparation for this session, we were discussing amongst the 5 of us and also with the organizers of the conference, various ideas for starting points for points of conversation and what sorts of problems, say, the technical community that could work on that would be directly useful. And we're really looking at different categories of problems that might be important for conversation. So on one hand, sort of maybe before I go into these slides, I'll talk for a little bit and hand it off to Mark. But there are really kind of two sorts of questions that were coming up a lot. One is, how to work with the numbers that are released for the 2020 decennial census, or currently being considered for release in the case of DHC, and also sort of what should we be doing going forward? What should Census be doing going forward in terms of how to think about these things? And I guess this next part of the discussion really focus on the first kind of question, and then maybe we'll open it up for a little more discussion after that, broader discussion. So like one thing that consistently came up is something that needs to be done is finding population estimates for custom areas. Okay, so here my input is some kind of geographic area, as Amy said, the Sharpie lines on the map. And what that really translates to, so these are not necessarily aligned with block boundaries. Really what that translates to is in terms of how that translates to the census is it's a list of included census areas, let's say blocks, or whatever, larger areas when they fit, and some of which are only partially included, right? So in some cases you're just getting a fraction of a unit. And of course the other input are the decennial measurements that the census is producing. And the goal is to estimate estimate the population in that specific area, ideally broken down by demographic, but even if you're just looking at total population, it's not always obvious, and with meaningful margins of error. So when the term margin of error, people use it for different things, but in this context, what we're talking about are confidence intervals for the privacy noise, as opposed to for other sources of error that are potentially introduced, that are potentially there. That's something we'll come back to, I guess, later. So we're not talking about sampling or undercoverage or anything like that. So one question, of course, is how to deal with divided blocks. That's actually done in a relatively straightforward way, we're told. Generally, the population for a divided unit is rescaled proportionally to the either to the captured area or to the fraction of, possibly the fraction of housing units that were captured. And so this, in terms of just formulating a mathematical problem, this is actually a relatively straightforward thing to think about. We're given, at least in the case of if you're working directly with the noisy measurement file. Okay. So you're given, the noisy measurement file is if you're working with the matrix mechanism style thing that the census is working with, I've got this pointer, there we go. What's being measured is there's some not true population, but whatever the census, the census edited file contents are, that's been transformed by some linear transformation to give quantities to which noise was added, and then we've got some known noise distribution, in this case normal, or discrete normal, but let's ignore that distinction. And so what we want is to find some abstractly, what we're being told is what we want is to find some linear combination of the underlying population counts, where the coefficients in this linear combination have to do with like which units are included and how much of each unit. And so that's a well-defined statistical problem, mathematical problem. You're trying to find the way to reconstruct the population with the least variance, and you want to understand what that variance is, and that's just a relatively straightforward minimization problem. Okay, so one type of thing one could do is sort of pose these questions for other like nonlinear things like ratios and these other formulas that that came up in some of the previous talks. But actually, the thing I want to point out is that, and we'll come, I'll use as a starting point for the discussion later also, is that like it's at this level of abstraction, it's very easy to solve the problem, but turning this into something that is like demographers can work with, that there is this like a very profound gap between this description and what demographers are going to likely to do, never mind what is sort of directly released by Census and how it's the format in which it's presented, right? It would be hard certainly for me to extract this, even to convert like a map with a Sharpie into this type of formulation for a specific instance. So another kind of problem that comes up are updates over time. So this is another sort of straight thing that we heard from several people, and that I think provides a fairly clean problem statement, which is that, again, here we've got some geography, and even it's interesting, it's non-trivial and interesting even if the geography does fit within the census hierarchy, and you've got measurements based on the decennial census, and then you've got other stuff, and somehow my slide is like looking weird, but something got messed up with the formatting with the conversion to PowerPoint, but maybe the point is you have decennial information from the decennial census and then update information of various kinds. So for example, you might have birth and death information possibly for a coarser level of geography. So that has to be somehow divided up and allocated to different subdemographics. But the idea is that you want to produce this time series of projections of the form that Amy had on her slide. And again, that is a relatively well-defined problem for which I think pretty crisp statistical solutions would be feasible. I don't know exactly what they'd look like, but Mark is going to talk a little bit about how that might look.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So I just wanted to briefly jump in to talk about, at least to put up a straw man for what the kind of model that you would possibly look at for computing these updates over time, and to see what kinds of like intermediate estimates and such would be productive to look at. So again, just as like a straw man for the housing unit method, if you want to estimate the population at time t, you might express that as a product of the number of housing units at time t times the household occupancy rate at time t times the quantity of the persons per household at time t. So for instance, if we wanted to estimate the population at 2022 using what Census provided in 2020, we need to make some modeling assumptions about how these various intermediate quantities depend on the 2020 product, as well as incorporating additional auxiliary information. So for instance, one way that you might estimate the number of housing units in 2022 is to take your baseline number from 2020 and add in the number of new building permits and take other public sources of auxiliary information to update that. You might make an assumption, for instance, that the household occupancy rate stays constant over the decade, based on like reading half of a paper in applied demography. This seems to be like a standard thing to do. PPH seems to be a more complicated quantity in general. Sometimes you can assume that pph stays constant. Sometimes you might try to extrapolate what pph looks like, for instance, using results from the previous 2 decennial censuses. So for instance, you might assume that the percent change in pph stays relatively constant, and that's one formulation that's expressed here. Other assumptions involve assuming that the change is going to be linear over time. You might also try to incorporate, other auxiliary sources of information to estimate pph. But the main point of this, again, just looking at this as a straw man for what these things might look like, is that this overall estimate for the population is some product of these intermediate, sometimes noisy estimates, some of which are themselves ratios of noisy quantities. And so it's natural to ask, what is the variance of each of these individual estimates? And even if you could compute the variance of each of the individual estimates, what's the variance of this product? Because now the terms in these products are highly correlated. As I think Eric alluded to, it's not necessarily the case that estimating population according to this strategy gives you the lowest variance estimate in terms of the underlying data that you were given. It might make more sense to directly estimate persons per occupied unit, for instance. So are there lower variance estimators for the thing that you actually want, the population, that are more compatible for eventually estimating variance and constructing confidence intervals? And if so, how do we estimate the variance of those, and how do we communicate those effectively to demographers and see if we can change existing pipelines to accommodate those instead? So again, this is a simple example. So there are much more sophisticated methods for estimation out there. You can consider breaking down population by housing type. In particular, one thing that's omitted from the model I mentioned was incorporating the effect of group quarters, which is often introduced as an additional term. Estimating pph in more complicated ways by incorporating post-decennial census data. And just working toward coming up with a more general framework for talking about and for reasoning about these problems. One possibly productive way of thinking about population estimates is that they're linear combinations of other quantities that you can get from the decennial release, but where the coefficients of this linear combination themselves depend on noisy data. And again, possibly productive intermediate things to reason about are ratios of noisy quantities, where the joint distribution of the noise on those quantities. And just to briefly mention the other method that's been discussed, in addition to the housing unit method, we saw the component method as well, where you might estimate the population in 2022 by taking the base population in 2020, using, say, county level birth or death records, as well as estimates of net migration. But this introduces its own set of challenges. Again, the data requirements for doing this are quite high. And again, this goes into the other issue of small geographies, right? The birth and death and migration data often comes at a higher geographic level of granularity than the thing that you're actually interested in. So it becomes a challenge to figure out how to allocate those updates down to lower levels of geography, and then estimate the uncertainty at the lower levels. So coming again toward an abstraction of this class of problems, it seems at the broadest level, what we might want to try to do is develop frameworks for estimating certain nonlinear functions of measured quantities. And again, this is interesting even when we know exactly what the noise distribution is on the data that we're given. And there are no sampling considerations at all about, we can take the data that we're given as ground truth plus perturbation that's introduced for differential privacy. So, again, the formulation of this is you're given this, set of noisy measurements, and a target function f, that your nonlinear function f of x, the underlying data that you want to compute. And you want to compute, say a least variance or maybe an unbiased estimate of f of x. And so some goals that folks like statisticians and computer scientists can try to think about is to, like the class of all nonlinear functions is some wild class that you couldn't hope to possibly address in one shot. But can we identify important subclasses of these nonlinear functions f, products and of ratios and such, powers of ratios, I don't know, linear combinations of ratios of low degree polynomials, something like this, that capture many of the existing estimation methodologies, as well as possibly unforeseen estimation methodologies along these lines. I guess I just wanted to wrap up by pointing out that even like the special case of estimating a single ratio turns out to be quite hairy and complex, owing in part due to the fact that denominators can go 0 and go negative. Even again, computing the asymptotic variance of ratios of quantities can be challenging. A promising way to do it is to actually think of inverting a hypothesis test to construct a confidence interval. So for instance, if you want to estimate A over B, you can construct a null hypothesis where A over B is equal to some point value, clear the denominator, and now you get a linear function. And now you take the linear function's hypothesis test, which is easy to reason about, and convert it to a confidence interval by taking the set of points that would not be rejected under that hypothesis test. And you can also see a talk in session 5 by Jayshree Sarathi on confidence intervals for medians and see some of the challenges that go into that as well. Now I'll pass it back to Adam.
Okay, so these are just a couple of examples, and really what we were trying to do is sort of translate some of the, both on one hand abstract out some of the problems that are coming up, talk to the demographers and check that we haven't lost too much in the translation, but then what remains is then, of course, to even then, I think and this is where like a broader discussion is really useful, is to think about what it takes to go from sort of technical answers to technical questions, which are well posed, crisp mathematical questions, to translate these into some form that's really useful. Okay, and this was like something that we were talking about among ourselves, but certainly didn't arrive at anything like a conclusion on. Some of the issues that come up are, first of all, that the sophistication of the people using the data varies widely. So like what it takes to produce, present something that is usable by someone like Eric or Jan is like very different from what it takes to present something that's usable by local officials when they're making, school, a school principal is trying to figure out how many kids are going to be in his third grade class or her third grade class 2 years from now. That's very, totally different kind of process. And another issue is sort of like just even just format, like how to pass on this information, right? So traditionally, Census has the most sophisticated kind of measures of error that come from what I've seen are like, there are these tables that are produced, and for some tables there are measures of error that are associated. You can figure out what the measure of error is for any particular table entry. But now we're in a situation where because of covariance, because of correlation among noise variables, for the kinds of things that Census is doing, you need a lot more than, if you're going to be aggregating these numbers, you need to know more than just the individual standard deviation variances of individual entries. You need to know basically the full covariance structure. And so how to present that in a format that's useful is like, even for something simple like linear statistics is not obvious. Okay, so just questions for points that we wanted to discuss, and I have a few more on my in my notebook based on the conversation we've had so far, because these slides were made a few days ago. You know, as I said, how to present solutions in a usable way. How to navigate the, another point is that I have on the slide is how to navigate trade-offs between consistency and accuracy. So how to, we understand that producing, when you're adding noise with the methods we have, when you're, if you force the information to be consistent, have no negative entries and things like that, you introduce weird forms of bias, especially with non-negativity. And, but maybe the broader question is how to navigate the trade-offs between sort of things like accuracy that are relatively easy to think about and other forms of, like, and sort of the ultimately important forms of usefulness of the data. So, as Jan was saying, that just reducing variances is not necessarily enough to make for useful data, right? And so in terms of what really matters is that, you know, how the data are used downstream. And so, you know, how do we think about how to make sure that the data are as useful as possible, and maybe at the, to put it in the technical language that that our community might use, is to say, like, what really should be the workload of queries we care about ultimately, as opposed to the things that are directly released, and what are the measures of error we should be using? You know, is it just absolute deviation, or is it something more complicated? So with that, I guess I'd like to open it up. And maybe the only point that's on this slide that has come up a lot in the discussions, so, well, surely not the only, but a big point that's not on this slide is sort of the discrepancy between a world where you take these statistics as truth, and sort of like, you know, the current like way that these statistics are used, in which they're sort of taken to be, you know, more or less reliable predictions, and one where every kind of piece of information that the census provides comes with like this uncertainty information with it. Like how do we bridge those? And so I'm not really sure what the answer is, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this. But it seems like one of the things that could be helpful would be, for the statistical community, is to look at the kinds of predictions that demographers make and think about how, even absent privacy, one should be associating uncertainty measures to those predictions, right? Because that might really help. So for example, you know, sometimes these things are exactly methods of accounting, right, as you said, but very often a lot of those terms are estimated, right? So for example, you know, I know birth data for my county, not for my town. I know migration data is, you know, a total mess, right? So a lot of these things are estimates, and so even absent privacy, you know, there are error bars there. We just don't know what they are, right? And so, like, for example, you know, how different would Amy's pictures have looked had, you know, the population projections, you know, hitting a wall when they encountered the decennial census numbers for 2020, if those population projections had come with sort of error bars, like, you know, would those error intervals have been like totally disjoint, but that suggests a real problem? Or is it, you know, is it the case that in fact they overlapped? It's just that the error bars on those later projections are really big, right? I don't know the answer, of course. But these seems like places where the technical, you know, there's a lot of room for conversation with the technical community, places where technical work could really help. So with that, I guess I'd like to open it up. There were probably questions that we didn't get to on the chat and on Zoom that maybe you all can help us out with. And then I guess we'll move the mics to the table, and we've got, I guess, 2 working mics, so we can pass those around. But really, we're happy to hear from all of you also.
Thank you, Adam. So I guess what we'll do now is to, in fact, show the remote attendees alongside your common chat section on our big screen here in our amphitheater. We have, in fact, quite a lively discussion that was happening while many of you have been presenting, and some of the questions have been asked, and there were inputs also from the remote audience members. I wonder what's the best way to do this. Do you want to perhaps... There was I think the last question that I thought was still a question that was not answered by anyone was a technical one that was by Salil. How about I will read this question loud now, and this is a question addressed to Mark. And I think for the rest of the audience members, if you have questions, why don't we just do the raise hand function, and we'll call on you to speak up in real time. So the question from Salil Vadan to Mark is that this is a technical question. For nonlinear functions like ratios, I guess that the variance is necessarily data dependent. So do we need more about what we mean by least variance estimator?
I think I might see the question. There's a question about order of quantifiers here, I guess. I guess, the strongest form of something that you might hope for is one estimation strategy that instance-wise will, where an instance is one ratio that you might be interested in estimating, gives you the minimal variance for that particular estimate. But this might not be attainable in general. So it's definitely a good question to tease out, the extent to which you can hope for, universal least variance estimation strategies, or whether you inherently have to do something that's specific to specific ratios and specific, classes of data. So. Just structuring the question, I agree, is still an interesting and open question. Thanks, Mark.
I have a question coming from Shelley.
Just to, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Just to follow up on Salil's question and your answer, I think, I think the key issue here, I agree, that is to identify these problems where you can find a kind of a quick and approximate solution. But technically, the whole problem is not that different from all the methods in the measurement error literature. And here you actually have explicit model, at least in principle, you know how the BP was done. You can write down the likelihood function. You treat it as missing data. What you observed is a sum of two things. And you have EM algorithm. You have the whole literature you can derive. But I do understand that these methodologies need to be translated. Whatever the method we come up with maybe need to be approximated, use some quick adjustment, and that probably depends on a large class of problem you identify what functions work. But I just want to mention that in general, statistically, this is a far easier problem compared to the traditional statistical disclosure limits, because there you don't know what the method was, and it's much harder to put down. But here you do have an explicit mechanism. But I do recognize that in reality, it probably is harder because all these post-processing, although it's transparent, it's make them much harder to actually put in the likelihood function, what all these things are being done. So I recognize it's easier, said, than done, but there is a general principle we can work on.
Yeah. One point to make about post-processing is that, we didn't go into the kind of technical difficulties that are caused by the post-processing, but certainly these problems are generally much easier to solve, at least at the level of abstraction I think of them, if you have access directly to the noisy measurement file. And I think those are probably, I think it would be great to focus on, for the community to look especially at those and argue for their release, although that's a whole other complicated question of why those things are not released. Maybe beyond the scope of this particular discussion. Yeah. But yeah, those are good points Shelley made about the connection to measurement error literature, for example, where here indeed the distributions are simpler and we get to design them, which makes a big difference. Yeah, there was a question in the back. Wait for the mic. Yeah, just wait for the microphone.
I just wanted to mention, because you talk about
Can you
measurement
say your
errors.
name and then?
Yeah, my name is Javier Cabrera. I am a professor here at Rutgers in statistics. I heard what you were saying about measurement error models. The issue that I think, if the errors are very small, then this is not going to be an issue, right? But if you are talking already about doing measurement error models, I worry that there are all kinds of things that can happen, like if you, for example, take a transformation, or a lot of the census data that I use in my work, I usually have to do some transformation, etc. Now you are transforming a quantity by a log or by some other function, right? That is, now you end up with a problem if the measurement errors are significant, then you have heteroscedastic problems. You're going to have basically skewness produced in the measurement error. I mean, if this is big enough, then this is complicated, I think, not standard. Is that any comment?
Maybe someone who works more with measurement error papers can say to what extent, how deep the disconnect is between the things that people have considered generally in that literature and these problems. Yeah. I don't know it well.
Hey, Adam, I could chime in on that. This is Gary King.
Yeah, we can hear you, Gary. Go ahead.
I totally agree. That was an excellent point. First of all, it was an excellent set of talks, but it was also an excellent comment by whoever made it in the audience. I don't know who that was. And I think the point combining what the two of you said is, and also what Xiaoli said is, yes, it is possible to fix these things, and it is completely unlike the measurement error literature because of the principles of differential privacy that this all must be transparent, and it is. However, as the commenter said, once you start messing with the data in different ways, like creating ratios or creating percentages and things like that, it just makes it harder. It's still possible, however. It just makes it a lot harder, so the standard results in the literature don't actually apply. Georgiana Evans and I wrote a paper on the Facebook, analyzing the Facebook differential privacy data, which is now, by the way, 55 trillion numbers. But the format of it is almost the same as the census, very similar anyway, without the constraints. And we wrote a paper, and then someone wrote us and said, hey, I want to take 3 of the explanatory, and we showed how to make all the corrections like Adam was explaining and Shelley was talking about. And someone wrote us a note and said, hey, we would like to take 2 of the explanatory variables, add them up, and then take the first one as a proportion of the 2 of them, right? Which is like something we do in data analysis all the time. But in this case, of course, it changes all the properties of all the variables, and we had to rederive everything from scratch. So it's possible, which is great, but it just makes it a lot harder.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so finding, this is where the finding things that scale well to use very broadly, by say local officials, becomes challenging. Maybe like another point we could discuss. I'm happy to take more questions if there are, since I don't see any. Let me pose two questions that maybe, I don't know, other panelists have thoughts on. One would be, okay, how could or should we as a broad community think about what measures of accuracy or usefulness the census should be thinking about? So, like, we understand that they're complicated, but on the other hand, we also understand that the only thing that works for every single possible application of the data is just releasing the raw data. And so how does a community, how does an agency like the Census arrive at criteria that it can try to optimize for to produce data that's as useful as possible? So I guess that I think the question, I'm interested in the question, I guess, at a more technical level, but that bleeds into questions of process and governance and things like that. So I don't know if you guys have things that you want to say one way or another on that broad question.
I'm going to try to restate your question. It's how good do you need it, or how bad can you stand it?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious whether the users, depending on the application, have a different answer for each of those, So.
I think for the so for the people that we're answering questions for, and this is kind of maybe the heart of my profession, right? So what we do as applied demographers is answer questions that people can't answer, right? So we have government officials, we have nonprofits, we have general citizens coming to us with questions. And we look at them and go, I have no idea. Give me a couple days and I'll see what I can come up with. And we take whatever data we can and we come up with as best of a solution as we can. And that's why one of the first things you learn in demography school, right, is to try to make as complete of a listing of your assumptions as possible. Because every estimate, every projection you make is wholly dependent upon the assumptions that are on which you're making that projection or estimation. There's a joke, and demographers have pretty dark humor a lot of times. But one of the jokes is, the day that I publish my projections is the day that they're wrong, right? As soon as I make them public, they're going to be wrong. One of the base assumptions, for example, and just for context, I was the state demographer in Michigan, and in 2018 we published our projections for the state of Michigan and all the counties. In 2018 we published those. And then in 2020, we have COVID. One of the base assumptions of a projection series, you're not going to have war, famine, or plague. Well, guess what? One of the big three hit, and my projections that I made in 2018, 2 years later, are garbage. And so we have to figure out how to move forward, right? So the reason that we use these methods is not because they're perfect. Sometimes it's not even because they're good. It's because it's the only way we have to answer a question that a user has. And rather than always being able to supply them with a confidence interval, we do always supply them with what we did, our methods, and our assumptions that we made for making a particular projection or estimate, because that is sometimes the best that we can do.
Yeah, I totally agree with Eric, and I think the size of the footnote is very important. Sometimes I think it happened a couple of times to me that I said, "This is an answer to your question," but I wouldn't use it.
Yes.
The question, yeah. Yes, you should wait for the microphone to find its way to you if you can, but
We can repeat it.
we're generous people.
Okay, so I think what I've noticed a lot in this session is there's a big difference between the kinds of abstractions that we talk about as technical people in terms of what we have access to versus what demographers have access to. And there's also a big difference in terms of sort of like the way in which there are normative practices around how we treat uncertainty. I know that someone posted Jayshree's paper in chat, which I'm sure is very relevant. You should definitely read it. But I think the other big problem is that these questions about the applicability of measurement error methodology, which has been around for decades in statistics, is something that is not currently enabled because of the top-down algorithm and because of the high-dimensional sparse nature of this data. So even though we could technically resolve these without access to that file, it would be very difficult for us in practice to decide whether or not these methods would correct or not. So I guess the question is, for everyone in this panel, do you think that the correct way is to wait for that to happen, or is there something that we should find as an alternative? Because there's a huge gap between the way we're abstracting these problems and what's technically capable with what we have right now.
Short of having access to the underlying data in a restricted data enclave, which as one of the RDC directors, I can tell you, Census has already told us, don't expect the 2020 data in the RDC anytime soon. Okay, so that's what I'm supposed to tell researchers that come asking. So that's closing one of your possible doorways, is getting into the data that way. With the post-process data, like you just said, it's very, very challenging, and I think that we need the data, the noisy measurements file without the post-processing to begin unpacking some of this. I guess that I hope that answered your question. It was just me coming out and saying, yes, I think that that is one of the viable avenues to explore this further and try to come up with ways to mitigate the unusable aspects of the data, to say that delicately. What are other options? Give up on census data, go find other data, you know? But that's going to have its own problems as well. A lot of the alternative data sources are already used in the modeling by applied demographers. So, and those sources themselves are not perfect. You know, I was trying to think about the question that came up earlier. You're treating vital records as though they are God's given truth. Well, there's also omissions there, but you're treating them as it's the data that you have that you need to move forward with. So there could be exploration of alternative series, but if you find one of them that's really good, you could start using Census as a benchmark, I guess, and then it's a $16 billion benchmarking exercise, as opposed to the purpose for which it has been historically used, which is the denominator, and it gives voice to the small areas. So.
Just as a technical point, yeah, I mean, I think one can formulate pretty crisp and clean technical problems for how to use the outputs of things like top-down. Top-down itself is complicated because it's got various heuristics that are used for the optimization, but you could come up with versions of it that are not so hard to reason about. I guess the real question is there is a question, where should the research community focus its attention, and it would be great if we could get the version of the census release that is most easy to work with statistically, but that's like maybe a different point. Yeah, Claire had a question.
Yeah, this is Claire Bowen from the Urban Institute. So my question kind of goes like one more step from Jeremy, was what is the framework for all of us then to help contribute to bring up this discussion? Because when you tell Congress people like, hey, we're going to have another file, and they're like, wait, what? Right? And so it makes me wonder, like, what are the next steps we need to do then to have this open discussion to keep moving forward given all this change in technology? Is it for us as statisticians or computer scientists or the other researchers in this ingrained in this field to say, hey, we'll work on this area, but we need some people to help translate what we're doing to the public policy makers in order for us to move forward with that. And so I guess this is both a question and a comment of like, how can we get that framework and for that to keep moving on? And also just like a quick plug, we need to standardize our language. I'm really frustrated with the fact that I just had like a reviewer comment on one of my papers saying like, you guys use algorithm, mechanism, and sanitizer. You need to pick one. I was like, I'm having a really hard time because the field has not decided what they want. And that's just in the privacy field, right? So we as privacy researchers need to figure out how we're going to standardize that. And then maybe we can work with other fields and say, hey, instead of saying maybe queries, maybe should we say statistics, because that's a little bit easier for people to kind of grok on. Anyways, I'm done now.
Claire, the work that needs done, is it to help us deal with the data that have already come out? Is it to help us move forward through the decade? Is it to have a lot of research building the evidence base to make perhaps different decisions for 2030? Is it the way that these pieces have to click together with the pop estimates and the ACS? And I hope the answer to all of those is yes. But that's the research agenda. You know, are we going to just break into groups and everybody pick the part that you like? You know, but how do you have integration and, like you said, standard language that's helping advance knowledge once people start digging into some of these problems? But I will also ask these guys, but there isn't a great desire to cross your arms and say, I want what I had before. Like, this is where we're at. We're moving forward. The question is, how do we move forward with the best information to do the work that demographers need to do? And also, how can you not have a repeat of this in 2030?
So just one thought that I was going to bring up as a kind of a discussion topic, but I'll make it just briefly, which is that, like, one thing that might be useful is to have a number of case studies of application where, you know, I don't know, predicting, you know, predicting enrollments for a school district, for example, right? So that's like a relatively concrete problem that is still pretty messy. That, you know, I could imagine a lot of you'd have to figure out a lot of things to solve that problem well with what the 2020 releases, and maybe we you know, we could think about over lunch or something other similarly specific narrow case studies that whose you know, solution would require that kind of, you know, wrestling with a bunch of these questions. Eric, do you want to send that down to Eric?
You know, as I think more and more about this, the focus on case studies, you know, because I understand that you know, you need to have something to work with, right? Is there a way for us to develop a random problem generator or something? Because that's kind of what our job is we get random problems from people. As an example, when I was working in Michigan, and I got a question from an individual. He wanted to know the number of 18-year-olds in the UP. Relatively easy question to answer. Answered him with a relatively high degree of certainty based on the data that I had. And then he telling me the reasons behind it, because he was pretty certain that we needed to prepare for an invasion of the UP. This guy's obviously crazy. But these are the types of questions that we get. They're kind of random questions that we need to answer, and then we need to do throughout the decade. So is there a statistical way to come up with a random question, random problem generator? Because that's going to be, I think, helpful to kind of understand the type of work that we do, honestly.
Okay. We are, say low on time is maybe understating it a little bit, but, you know, low on time, let's say. Jan, you wanted to add something, then we'll take a last question from Sesha and wrap up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that having this dialogue and meeting is very important to us, and I cannot speak for other demographers. I'm not going to follow the statistical literature on this. That's just, you know, I don't understand half of it, and I will not be following it. So this discussion and this contact need to be open, and yeah, we need to be alerted that there are developments.
So last question, we'll try to keep it short.
Yeah. So I think this is related to what Adam mentioned earlier, talking about, you know, can we stop providing some error bars? And I think it's related in part to what Claire was talking about. How do we communicate these results? And I think we're at the stage where, yes, we can think about methodologies that we need to develop to provide accurate estimates, but it's as much about that as it is about how we communicate these. And I think I will be interested in knowing, for your clients, right, from whom you're doing the calculations that you do, again, can we think about, do you think there is a space that while we're developing different methods, we can also explore how we communicate those results to your typical users? Can we start adding error bars? You know, start with your current, don't forget about privacy in part, as Adam was saying, and then include the privacy error bars with that. I feel like that has to happen simultaneously as we are discussing perhaps more complex methodological questions in terms of estimation and accuracy. Communicating these results and start with what we have already. And I will be curious to know, is there space for something like that? What do you have a sense from your user base, right? And maybe that's part of the education, right, that has to happen. But so maybe that's a lunch discussion. So how about I'm not expecting an answer. It's an open question. So thank you.
Maybe we should end there then, and we'll break for lunch, and we resume at whatever time we resume at. Yeah, all right. Thank you.